Welcome to the Latin America Regional Advisory Committee's webinar series, A Path to a Career in Geophysics. Dr. Sergio Chavez Perez, Chair of the SEG Latin America Regional Advisory Committee, and myself, Lori Whitesell, will serve as your host for today's webinar. Before we begin, the model for this webinar will be a short presentation followed by an extended question and answer session. However, if you have a question prior to the conclusion of the presentation, please feel free to ask. In order to ask questions, you have two options. Please raise your hand in the webinar interface and/or place your question in the chat box. And the question will be answered by the presenter. Today's presenter is George Buzan, whose career spans more than 40 years and has involved all major aspects of geophysical process, acquisition, processing of seismic data, as well as potential field data. He has worked on projects in the Americas from the Beaufort Sea to the Straits of Magellan, as well as the Middle East, North Africa, and Sub-Saharan Africa. His current position is Sales Manager for CGG for Latin America. He resides in Houston, Texas. And with that, George, please take it away.
Great, thank you very much, Lori, and thank you, Sergio. Before we get started too much into the presentation, I wanted to remind everybody that October 10th today is World Mental Health Day. And so we should remember that as we go forward. And I just wanted to say that my goal and desire for the presentation today is that your mental health after my presentation is just as good as your mental health before we start. So thank you very much. Briefly just say that growing up as a child, my father was in the military, so we moved all around. And that was good preparation for life as a geophysicist, since we've moved around not just in the United States, but also overseas. In school, in high school, and elementary school, my favorite subjects were math, geography, natural science, geometry, and the Spanish language. And of course, since we lived a number of years in Puerto Rico, I was able to pick up Spanish at an early age. And I put geometry because I really like geometry, and I think geometry was a especially good preparation for doing what a lot of what we do in geophysics is look at shapes and structural geology. So I just thought I'd mention that. My education, I got a high school degree from San Antonio, Texas, which I really call home. I went to university at Princeton University in New Jersey, which I liked. And the reason I didn't go to school here in Texas is that the curriculum or the study courses that they had in the universities here in Texas were so strict that they didn't allow a lot of options or chances to explore stuff in the curriculum. At least in Princeton, I had that. And so when I started out at Princeton, I started out thinking I was going to study chemical engineering, and I changed to civil engineering, and finally by the end of the second year, geological engineering or geophysics. My first experiences with exploration was with a mining company in Mexico, MyMX. I did mineral exploration in the northern state of Zacatecas and Durango. My second year, I did between sophomore and junior year, I did geology field camp in Montana and Wyoming, and of course those are good places for mineral exploration. And then the summer between junior year and senior year, I went with some other faculty members. I went with faculty members to Venezuela, and I did a gravity study around various parts of the northern part of Venezuela. And my senior thesis then was the reduction of the gravity data and modeling and interpretation of the gravity data to try and establish whether or not the Via de Cura series, which is a large metamorphic complex just south of Caracas, to see whether it was a loctinus or a toctinus. And that's part of that thesis then was then the basis of one of my two publications. Subsequently, in my education, I studied for a master's degree in geophysics, both at Texas A&M, which I had to leave because I ran out of money when I studied, and then I continued my master's education at University of Houston, which was really an interesting place when I went there, because the master's program was predominantly a night program for industry people. It was led by Milton Dobrin, who had one of the first text that was used called geophysical prospecting. And he was really a fabulous teacher. And of course, there's other seminal sort of titans in the industry: Robert Sheriff from Chevron, Mike Grell, who was also at Chevron. Fred Hilterman had just left Mobil and started teaching processing at there. And then one of Milton's colleagues, Louis Nettleton, who wrote, was a sort of a titan in gravity prospecting, also helped out teaching. And then finally, later on, I got my MBA from Pepperdine University. I sort of between Princeton and graduate school, I took a year off. I worked in New York City, and I worked as a translator, translating credit reports from Spanish to Portuguese. And language has always been one of my hobbies, I would say. I started working in the industry in 1974 with a company called GSI. No longer exists. It was formed, ended up being part of Halliburton Geophysical, which was bought by Western, which now Western Geophysical has eliminated its acquisition division. So a large part of what we used to do, or the people we used to know, no longer exist in the industry. I started out as a data processor using two different softwares, the 700 package and TypeX, which was a more advanced software. The 700 package was pretty interesting because to program and run our programs and process the data, we basically had to program ones and zeros. We'd give what we wanted to do as ones and zeros to the ladies that we'd call flexo ladies, because they would produce paper tape, which was then fed into the computer and programs run. So much different than the interactive methods that we use today. GSI Houston was interesting, and of course I got the idea in Houston that if you were going to be a doodlebugger, and of course doodlebugger is an English word that we used to refer to people that had acquisition experience. If you're going to be a doodlebugger, you had to do two things. You had to have worked in Saudi Arabia, and you had to have been thrown in jail at least one time. And so I had the chance in early 1976 to go to work in Saudi Arabia. GSI, we had crews working for Saudi Aramco, and that was really a fabulous experience for a young geophysicist, because one of the things that, Aramco at that time, of course, was owned by ExxonMobil, Chevron, and Texaco. It was before it was nationalized, and because of the reserves there, Aramco did everything in the field. So it was really a laboratory and a learning experience for all of us that were doing geophysics. So we did seismic with explosives, seismic with vibrators. We drilled up holes. The geophysicist would shoot up holes. We did refraction profiles. We did mud logging, surface geology. Got to do surveying, got to do gravity prospecting, got to work as observers. And so we did the whole 9 yards. Saudi was an interesting place also because of the people that you saw go work there. So Malcolm Lansley, who's produces courses for the SEG. I met him there. Bob Brook, who is a director in the SEG. Bob Brook succeeded me as a field geophysicist on the Crew G3 down in the empty quarter in Saudi Arabia. I did that for 3 years, and I'd just say that I also had the experience of getting to spend 24 hours in jail in Saudi to complete my baptism as a doodlebugger. The Saudis, of course, when they would change laws or implement new regulations, would announce it on a Friday night on the Arabic station, and because we didn't have the English-speaking community didn't have a television station or a radio there, they would go out the next day and the Saudi police and arrest the gringos that were driving around or doing something and throw them in jail. And through word of mouth, the news got out very rapidly. So the Saturday morning after the Saudis had declared that it was against the law to take a right turn on a red light, I got stopped by some Saudi gendarmes and taken to jail, and I got to spend the night with 17 other colleagues that had committed similar infractions. But anyway, that's a side story. The next few years also were extremely good learning experiences. I went to Midland. After Saudi, I was a technical supervisor where I was responsible for 3 processing, 3 acquisition crews. And West Texas was interesting. Of course, it's a beehive of activity now, but it was interesting because ARCO at the time, which is now a division of BP, was doing shearwave acquisition and processing. So I got to participate in that. From there, I went to Mexico. Mexico also broadened my experience because we had not just dynamite and vibrator crews, but we did geochemical exploration as well. And one of the highlights of working in Mexico is that while I spent a year there as operations manager, I met Ruben Martinez, who's another SEG director, who was processing manager for GSI in Mexico at the time. We both worked for a really distinguished Mexican geophysicist who was general manager, Andres Ramirez Barrera. And I mention him because he's really a leading light, or well, he's deceased now. He was a leading light in Mexican exploration, and because he had a real strong belief in training. And so all the young Mexican geophysicists, a number of them who went on to work for Pemex, and some are still in Pemex in high positions, got training not just in field acquisition or processing, but also interpretation. From there, from Mexico, I went to Anchorage, Alaska, and of course, Anchorage in Alaska was a really interesting place to work in the early '80s. When we went there in the first year, winter of 1981-82, there were 22 crews working on the North Slope of Alaska. I was running multi-client projects. And I say the highlight of my Alaska experience, and I think probably the highlight of my career. And I don't want you to feel bad that the highlight of my career happened when I was 33, and I'm now considerably older than 33. But the highlight of my career, I believe, was I was a principal author and project manager for the exploration plan for the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. We did 2 winter seasons of seismic work on the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. It's the only seismic work and the only exploration that's been done in the area. It was a really interesting project in that we had 2 crews working for 2 years. The seismic was dynamite crews. We did gravity and mag exploration as well. We did surface geology. We did micropaleontology. We did geochemistry, surface geochemistry, and we did environmental analysis. And so it was a project, a multi-client project, where we had 23 companies, all the major companies that you have today, and a number of companies that don't exist today anymore. But it was a very well attended project. The other interesting thing that happened in the Arctic, while I was in Anchorage, is that we did a site survey. I was project manager for the site survey for a well that was drilled in Harrison Bay, just northwest of Prudhoe Bay there. That was the most expensive dry hole in history, and probably the most expensive hole in history. It was drilled in 1983 for a total cost of US $1 billion. The people that did sort of the post-mortem of the drilling of the hole decided that it looked like there had been hydrocarbons in the reservoir, but they had migrated southeast to onshore rather than being offshore, onshore into the Caparic Field. And of course, you know, Caparic Field is the field that sort of succeeded Prudhoe Bay as a prolific producer on the north slope, and is dominated by, was discovered by ConocoPhillips. From Alaska, I got promoted to be general manager in Denver, Colorado, general manager of Western U.S. exploration, and that was an sort of exciting time, sort of exciting in the negative sense, in that you know, everybody's aware, most all of us are aware that we've really suffered, and the biggest downturn in my career has been this downturn that started in 2014. We've seen, you know, hundreds of thousands of employees in the business laid off, and my company, for example, in the acquisition division, we've laid off 70% of our people. But the 84, 85, 86 downturn was also a horrendous downturn, and just bad news after bad news. As general manager, I went there in November of 84. I was responsible for 750 employees. And when I left in July of 1986, I only left 33 employees in the whole division. So it was a difficult time for a young manager for me. But one of the things I learned, and I think we see today as well, is that getting laid off, there's no stigma to getting laid off. And that the people that got laid off that took it as a tragedy, it really ended up being a tragedy. And those that got laid off and sort of took it as just another bump in the road, then it was just another bump in the road, and they were able to continue on and do things and get other jobs in the industry. In July of 1986, then I was transferred to Argentina as general manager of the operation there. I ended up running as many as 6 land crews and 5 processing centers in Buenos Aires and other parts of Argentina, from Rio Gallegos in the south to San Pedro de Jujuy in the north. And Argentina was very active at that time. The government had opened lots of areas onshore and a few offshore. So one of the projects we did, a marine project for Exxon offshore in the Rousen Basin, which is just offshore the peninsula Valdez. Other projects I got involved in were selling the time map to ENAP in Punta Arenas and selling the first DFS-7. DFS-7 was the successor set of instruments. It was a distributed system produced by Texas Instruments at the time. We sold one to YPF. It was also in Argentina that I started my friendship with Gustavo Carstens, who's also a director in SCG now and recently elected to be council president or council director. And so we've stayed in contact since 1987. Things took another turn. My career took another turn. I went to New Orleans in 1990, and I was running ocean bottom seismic crews. This was before the advent of ocean bottom nodes, which are sort of the I shouldn't say fad, but they're sort of the hot topic in acquisition today offshore. Bottom cable crews, we had sensors connected to cables and laid them out, of course, under the water. I ran crews in the Gulf Coast of Louisiana, but also we ended up doing a relatively long project for Lagovin in Lake Maracaibo, in southeast Lake Maracaibo in the Buenaventura area. That was an interesting project because the Lagovin people were advised or consulted on, had the consulting of Exxon Production Research Company, John Ride and Raymond Young. And so that was a really interesting project. It also ended up being the subject of the only other publication I have to my credit, which was published, which was an article about ocean bottom cable seismic, published in the Proceedings of Expro. 1993, which at the end of 19 years of continuous employment with GSI and Halliburton Geophysical, I left the company just before it was sold to Western Geophysical. I left the company and went to work for Input Output as their Latin America sales manager. So that was a great experience because I did sales. I did system sales to companies in Colombia like Gapson Seismical, or Venezuela like Suela Petrol, or Argentina UGA, or in Brazil with Everest. But also, since we were really selling the first 24-bit acquisition systems, land acquisition systems, I spent a lot of time traveling Latin America and making presentations to the national oil companies and the local oil companies, discussing the 24-bit systems, what increased dynamic range and better harmonic distortion and better performance on their systems would mean for the seismic data. So that was a great experience. I continued working for input output, but I moved then to Buenos Aires in 1996, and so rather than work from Houston, I worked from Buenos Aires. Traveling was the same amount, and the cost of traveling was the same amount. But 1996 was also the year that I got married, which was one of the motivations for me moving to Buenos Aires. And so I got married to my wife, who will be accompanying me to the SEG in the meeting next week. And so I hope you get a chance to meet her. But I continued working for Input Output then, doing the same things until 1999, when we had another downturn. Not as serious as the one we are still experiencing, but I had a downturn and I got laid off by Input Output, and I went into business for myself. So I named the company Gamma Beta, and Gamma Beta is a not too very well disguised initials for George Buzan International. And so what I did for basically 2.5 years, I acted as a representative and agent really in the Southern Cone. So I was working Chile, Bolivia, Paraguay, Uruguay, Argentina, representing companies like Geospace, the instrument geophone manufacturer, Mitcham Industries. I sold software for Landmark and Geographics and Green Mountain. Also repped for a while Trace Exploration, which was a Canadian seismic company. And that was a great experience as an entrepreneur. As an entrepreneur and president of a company, I was able to, I can proudly say, that I did not ever go 1 month without invoicing some money. But the truth of the matter is that while I was invoicing every month, my cost of sales in the 2.5 years exceeded my invoicing by about $300,000, and so that motivated me financially to realize that I wasn't probably going to make it as an entrepreneur, and so I started looking for another job. One of the good things I'll say just before I go to the next slide is working for Geospace is I got to meet Sergio Chavez Perez, who was working for the INP at the time in Mexico. I was representing Geospace and was visiting with Sergio to discuss a crosswell tomography project that I was trying to sell to him. Somebody else was more successful in selling the crosswell tomography job to Sergio, but we remained friends ever since. So the job I was able to get when I started looking in 2001 was I was offered a job to be general manager of PGS Land, and I accepted it. That was a really interesting job, and I moved my family there in January of 2004. Aramco was still continuing to be a great experience. We were doing stuff, instead of doing just small seismic crews, we were doing 24-hour operation land crews with 24 vibrators, 3,000 or 4,000 channels of seismic work. We weren't doing upholes anymore. We weren't doing refraction surveys anymore, but we were doing advanced geochemistry using materials that were produced by Gore-Tex, and so that was another interesting part of that that job. But the contract ran out at the end of 2003. I'll say Saudi was a great experience, and what people find hard to believe, it was also a great experience for the family. My family loved it. Some people were concerned, I guess, if you remember the second Gulf War, which was the one that George H.W. Bush got engaged in with to expel the Iraqis from Kuwait, started in June of that year. Some people were concerned, but it really didn't affect many people outside of Iraq. And so, as my contract ended, my wife and I had a debate about whether we should return to live in Argentina or move to Houston. And the job market in either place was not very good. The job market in Houston was a little bit better than in Argentina, which helped us decide. But the really deciding factor were other family considerations, and this is something, you know, our kids, of course, we don't speak English at home. We don't speak English at home, and when we moved the family to Saudi, the kids who had studied some English in school didn't really have the ability in English to perform well in school. And so when we moved them to Saudi Arabia, they ended up repeating the second semester of the year they had completed in Argentina. And of course, I need to explain that, you know, in the Southern Hemisphere, of course, in the Southern Hemisphere, the school year in Argentina, for example, school year in Chile and other places, the school year, the fall semester starts in March. And the second semester ends in the first half of December. And so you can imagine, for example, our oldest daughter finished the second semester of ninth grade in December of 2003. And then we moved her and the other kids, well, we didn't move them, they accompanied us to Saudi. And then each one of the kids ended up repeating the second semester of the school. So my oldest daughter repeated second semester of ninth grade, which did two things. It helped review their studies, so they improved on that, but it also improved their English to the point where then in the fall of 2002, in September 2002, they were able to start school with English that was good enough that they could perform well. But then when the contract ended in Saudi, we had the dilemma that if we moved back to Argentina, they would have had to repeat again because of the out-of-phase nature of the school years. They would have had to repeat the second semester of their last school year in Saudi, which wouldn't have been a problem, but it would put them a year basically behind. They would have lost a year. For being 2 years out of Argentina, they would have ended up being 1 year behind what they would have been if we hadn't left Argentina. But socially, also, probably the more difficult part would be that would have been that they would end up being a year behind all the friends that they had in school. So anyway, we decided to move to Houston, and we've lived here basically ever since. We've lived here ever since, and the family, the five of us, the two girls have become citizens. and my wife and my son are still thinking about becoming citizens, but they're all legal residents. So I started in 2004 for CGG as a business development manager for multi-client projects. Of course, it takes a while to get projects going. I had two successful projects, both in Colombia, the Abadinco del Magdalena and the Taigona Profunda. They were successful in the sense that we performed them, we processed them, and we sold the data and actually made money on the projects. In 2007, as what happens in this dynamic industry, CGG bought Veritas and formed CGG Veritas, and that's been good for the company. But like a lot of times in mergers or acquisitions, some of us get sidelined for a while, and in the merger time, I ended up not really having a very well-defined job. I wasn't going to get laid off. They thought I'd performed well, but I didn't have a very well-defined job. And of course, in 2007, I was 57. So you guys can now figure out how old I am. I was 57, and I knew I had the confidence that probably, based on previous experience and observation, I would probably within 2 or 3 years, and having the fallout get through from the merger acquisition activity, I would get another job that was a little more significant, or that I felt I could contribute in. But at 57, I didn't want to really waste 3 years doing what I considered inconsequential stuff, because I didn't think I would necessarily have that much career left. So I went back to work for PGS in the Marine Division rather than the Land Division. And so I was doing basically the same thing for PGS that I was doing with CGG. My PGS activity was in some ways more successful than what I was doing in CGG, and part of that success is basically I was able to build on some of the relationships that I had developed when I was at CGG to actually implement projects that CGG had been lukewarm about when I was working for them. And so I was able to do projects in Trinidad, in Guyana, Colombia, and Honduras. And the exception, I did 2 projects in Colombia, and with the exception of one of the projects I did in Colombia, all of the projects I did in those areas were successful in the sense that they sold, the various data sets were licensed, and they made money. In 2010, I was invited back to CGG, and of course, you'll see that's 3 years after the acquisition of Veritas, and you can see by that time, and that's my experience, that after a merger acquisition, it really takes a new company 2 or 3 years to sort of to work out some of the politics involved in forming a new company. But in 2010, I was invited back to CGG to be sales manager for Latin America. So I started concentrating on land sales. CGG decided to get out of the land business. And so really since 2017, I've been concentrating on marine acquisition sales. I've been doing that ever since, with having successful projects in Colombia and Guyana, Suriname, and Brazil. in the last 10 years, I'd say the most interesting year I spent was the year of 2016. And because of my language, my ability to speak Portuguese, and my technical background, of course, which is not as technical as it was 40 years ago, but I still have a good technical understanding of what was going on. I was able to serve as a liaison between CGG Research, who is doing research on a new seismic source, and universities, a couple of universities in Brazil, who we were working with to develop some parts of the new seismic source. So I did that. I came back in 2017, a year ago, and since that time, I've been here in Houston. Doing marine acquisition and sales. And I suppose one of the things that I should mention about the seismic, the research liaison, and what I think about education and what I think about our business is that you know, and I've been probably partly lucky, or maybe mostly lucky, depending on who you talk to, mostly lucky, but also I worked at it as well, is that I think if you want to stay in this business and prosper in this business, you'll need to think about continuous education and continuous improvement. And so certainly, you know, I became, while I was in 14 years ago, I became a registered professional geophysicist in the state of Texas. One of the requirements to maintain your classification registration is you have to do continuing education at least 14 hours every year. I've been doing that since that time, but I was doing it before, and I think that's absolutely essential if you're going to stay abreast of what's happening. And I give the example that when I started in data processing, I'd just come out of graduate school, and so I was pretty smart. Well, pretty smart, yeah. So I don't want that to sound that arrogant. I was pretty smart, but when we were processing in GSI, and GSI was noted as being the most technically advanced seismic company at the time, migration was not a standard process in processing. And in the migration algorithms we used, the software package we used was called MStack5, because it was the fifth iteration or the fifth version of our migration software, which tells you we had one version of migration software. And of course, anybody in the business now knows that there's about 50 different migration methods and algorithms. There's FX, FD, all different kinds. But, you know, you're not going to stay abreast of all the developments in the industry unless you do continuing education. The SEG is a good place to do that. AAPG, other societies. As far as my professional associations, which I'll just use to finish off, I've been a member of the SEG since 1974. I've been a member of the Regional Advisory Committee, Latin America Regional Advisory Committee, since 2012, and I'm due to assume as the chairman of the Global Advisory Committee next year, or at the end of this annual meeting next week. I always try and participate in the local societies, and of course, some places that I've been, they don't have local societies, but I participated in the Geophysical Society of Alaska, and of course, these jobs as vice president, I'll just mention the second vice president's responsibility was the organization of the annual barbecue. So I have experience, and you'll see, and I hope I get to see some of you at the Latin America luncheon next Tuesday. And so you'll see I helped organize that, but my preparation for helping organize luncheons came from my barbecue experience in Alaska. I've been a member of the Asociación Mexicana de Geofísicos de Exploración since 1992, and I was one of the founding members of the Asociación Argentina de Geólogos y Geofísicos Petroleros that was started in 1993. And that finishes everything that I think I had to say, and so I didn't see anybody asking questions during, but I'm open to questions now. And what I'd say just before Lori starts passing me the plethora of questions is that if for some reason you can't think of your question now, and an hour from now or tomorrow you think of a question you'd like to ask me, please feel free to send me an email to george.buzan@cgg.com, and I'll be glad to answer any questions you have. Thank you very much.
Okay. There is a question. It says you've been fairly versatile during your career, and what do you attribute that to? Is it in addition to your continuing education? What would you attribute that to? And how did you succeed during downturns when others did not?
That's a good question. I think part of my early success was due to ambition. I was pretty ambitious. I wanted to climb the ladder, and so I worked very hard. And I think working very hard is a key to success and to staying around. It's not necessarily a guarantee, although I would say that what I see, nobody's immune to being laid off, but the really good people don't have a problem eventually getting back to work. I think I've been able to get other jobs, and because I've been curious, and so I think, and especially the earlier part of my career, I felt like 3 years or 4 years in the job was more than else to sort of learn the job and get good at it, and then but then I was antsy to get on and do something else, and I thought everything was interesting, so I was curious, and so I was when I went to work selling instruments, which I'd been in acquisition operations for almost 20 years. I went to work for selling instruments. It was interesting to me because I was learning things. Of course, I'd used instruments before. I'd actually worked as junior observer on some seismic crews, but then you learn the geophysics between that goes into determining the instruments or designing the instruments. So, for example, and one of the things that you learn, for example, or that we learn from Dobrin, is a very small book by Nigel Anstey, where Nigel Anstey develops a theoretical basis of how much dynamic range we need for our instruments. And so, and this is 40 years ago that he did this. He came up with the determination of that we really need 120 dB of dynamic range. And of course, because of electronics, in the previous systems we only had 84 dB of instantaneous dynamic range, and then we had sliding scales to try and get more. And then with the development of the 24-bit system, we got our 120 dB instantaneous dynamic range. And so those are the kind of things you learn a little bit, you get curious, there's more things to learn, and the whole process is just really interesting to me. I guess the beautiful thing to me about our work as geophysicists and geoscientists is that it's a whole big world out there, and there's whole lots of different things that we can do.
Okay, there's another question, and it says, you had a lot of different interests in school when you were younger, geometry and geography and other things, and you've gotten to travel the world quite a bit. Are there any recommendations on course preparation for students who are thinking about becoming a geophysicist that you would recommend?
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, math and science and physics, but also natural science are good course recommendations. But also, I mean, I think if you're interested in the traveling part, you know, it's certainly good to get other languages. So, you know, there's no doubt in my mind that you know, the fact that I could speak Spanish helped to motivate my first transfer to Mexico in 1981, and then the fact that I had learned Arabic. I don't speak Arabic as well as I speak Spanish or Portuguese, but the fact that I had learned Arabic in Saudi, and some people still remembered that, helped to get me my second job back in Saudi. And so I think some of these other things, some of the personal interests you have, which sort of, as I say, languages are my hobby, can help broaden what you do as you go about in your career.
Okay, thanks. Another question. It says you've stated that you had a couple really formative or best experiences during your presentation. Which do you think was the most influential on your career longevity?
I would say the experience, my first experience as a field geophysicist in Saudi, where I was there 3 years, and it was a time when we were doing lots of things in the field, and I got a big, broad background on the whole process. Of course, I'd been in processing for a while, so at the end of that time, I came out with a really great background. And of course, acquisition has been a hobby of mine, interesting for me. And I think the other thing, going back to part of the success, is that, you know, when you're doing data processing or when you're in the acquisition, you know, when you're on the field crew, lots of times it's not going to be super interesting. There's going to be times when it's just work, and it's hard work, and you've got to do it. And I think you have to take the attitude, well, you know, it's hard work, but I'm going to do it, and I'm going to learn something. And so I think most of the experiences you have can be great experiences if you have the attitude that I'm going to learn something. Maybe not a lot today, but I'm going to learn something today.
Okay. Anybody else have a question? Any more questions?
Can I say something?
Yes.
It's not really questions, but mostly quick comments. Because as George mentioned, I met George back in, when was it, 2000?
2000, yes.
2000. And so instead of making a question, I want to make this comment in terms of how interesting it was for me to listen to this. I'm biased because I know and I do respect George a lot. But I want to show why I want to say why I do have this respect for George. Aside from all his career as a person, I think he epitomizes this attitude about. He mentioned attitude at the end, but he epitomizes this patience, this willingness to learn, this continuous education attitude. And it looks like that helps people like him and some others. It really helps any of us when we become, and I'm going to use a Spanish term here, and I'm sure George knows the term. So George is a viejo lobo. And when we say viejo lobo, that means he's a wise person. And the only way that you become wise seems to be the way George described the evolution of his career. And that means knowing lots of things, not only, I'm not only about academic degrees, but I'm thinking about the language, about the evolution with the topics, and so on. So he faced the worst downturn in history, which was 85, 86. I mean, geophysicists were selling ties at the time because there were no jobs, and so on. So I want to stop, but my main comment is I think George he really epitomizes some of the things that we tend to complain about with the younger generations. So lack of patience, he goes the other way, lack of this continuous education attitude. So I really enjoy the seminar. Again, I'm biased because I respect George a lot, but I think he shows a little bit or a lot of what we would like to tell younger generations. So like do this and do that and be patient like him, do as he suggested, keep an open mind and so on. Thanks a lot, George.
Thank you, Sergio.
Okay. I guess I have one question. You've been a member of SCG for a long time, and I currently work for SCG, but I'm also a geoscientist.
Mm-hmm.
What would you say is the most beneficial thing for you personally and your career that you've gotten from being a member of SCG? Because there's a lot of different ideas, but it's always great to hear from presenters what they feel was the most impactful part of being a member.
Well, I would say there's two things, and of course I'll go back to the continuing education, and that's been a very important thing for me throughout my career, because I've been doing continuing education every year since I've been a member. And of course, the problem with having been a member for 44 years is that I've taken almost all the courses that have been given. So that's one thing that's very important. The other sort of things, the distinguished instructor short courses, the distinguished lecture, the honorary lectures, those are things that are events that I try and attend and help keep me update. But I'd say really, I would say really the SCG, the annual meeting, which of course helps maintain my technical side to where I want it to be, but also as a networking place. And so, you know, for those of us that are in sales and we get our travel budgets cut during the downturns, the SCG really becomes a critical place to go and attend to and maintain the network. You know, and so there's people that I'm going to see, people from Chile that I haven't seen since last year at the SCG, people from Colombia, because I haven't been able to go back to Colombia for the last 3 or 4 years, that are going to be, you know, Jaime Checa, who I've known since 1993, and I haven't seen him in 5 years. I get to see him. And so it's really the networking that gets done in SCG. Networking at places like the Icebreaker, and networking in the exhibit hall. And one of the things I want to sort of give an advertisement for the exhibition hall. And one of the things that I find is that is one of the great things in the exhibit hall is to go to the booths, and you can get in 30 minutes or 40 minutes a presentation on a particular company's technology, and where, yes, it is an advertisement, there's a lot of sort of small technical tidbits that you can pick up on that help you, and so it's a good thing. Hope that's not too long an answer.
No, you know, it's always interesting for me to hear different perspectives from different presenters. So, thank you. Any last questions? All right. I think we're no more questions. I guess I'll wrap up here. So thank you, George, and thank all of you for attending the SCG Latin America Regional Advisory Committee's webinar as part of our webinar series, A Path to a Career in Geophysics. Please respond to the following follow-up webinar email. Let us know what you liked, what could be done better, and suggestions for future webinar topics. Please look for our social media posts to register for next month's interesting talk by Maria Angela Capello. And thank you again for attending today. And thank you, George, for a very interesting presentation.
Thank you.
Ciao.
So I will see you in Anaheim.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.